In 1994, 6 of the most dangerous motorcycle gangs in the world gather in secret. They sign a pact that would change Australia's criminal underworld forever. But one American powerhouse wasn't invited. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club, founded in 1935, one of America's big 4 gangs, decided they didn't need permission. They were coming to Australia anyway. What happened next became one of the most unusual failures in outlaw biker history. This is the story of how America's oldest motorcycle gang tried to conquer a continent and crashed headfirst into a brick wall they never saw coming. Main script. To understand why the Outlaws failed in Australia, you need to understand what they were walking into. By the early 1990s, Australia's biker scene was unlike anywhere else on Earth. While most countries saw 1 or 2 clubs dominate, like the Hells Angels in Canada or Europe, Australia was a battleground. The rebels, Comancheros, Bandidos, Hells Angels, Gypsy Jokers, and dozens of smaller clubs had carved out their territories through decades of blood and violence. Then came 1984, the Milperra Massacre. Father's Day turned into a war zone when the Comancheros and Bandidos engaged in a gunfight in broad daylight. 7 people died, including an innocent teenage girl. The massacre shocked the nation and put every biker gang under a microscope. But the violence didn't stop. It got worse. By 1994, Australia had 178 registered outlaw motorcycle clubs. The territory wars were escalating. Drug trade profits were skyrocketing. Something had to give. In early 1994, representatives from 6 major gangs met in Sydney for what would become known as the Australia 2000 Summit. The Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Bandidos, the Rebels, the Black Oolans, and the Nomads gathered with one goal: divide Australia among themselves and eliminate everyone else. They called it the Australia 2000 Pact. The agreement was simple. By the year 2000, only these 6 clubs would control all criminal activities in Australia. Every smaller club would be absorbed or destroyed. But here's where it gets interesting. When this pact was announced, the Outlaws MC were actually included in the agreement. They were one of the chosen 6. On paper, they had permission to operate in Australia. In 1994, the Outlaws officially established their Australian chapter, becoming part of the American Outlaws Association's international expansion. This should have been a victory lap. The Outlaws MC had just expanded to their 5th continent. They were now operating in America, Canada, Europe, Australia, and Asia. Chapters were being established, members were being recruited, and everything seemed perfect. So what went wrong? The first problem was timing. The Australia 2000 Pact immediately triggered what became known as the consolidation period. Between 1994 and 2000, a brutal war erupted across Australia. The larger clubs began systematically eliminating smaller ones. 35 murders occurred in 6 years. The number of clubs dropped from 178 to just 32. This wasn't gang warfare, this was extermination. While this bloodbath unfolded, the Outlaws were trying to establish their presence. But they faced a critical disadvantage. They were outsiders trying to build from scratch, while everyone else was already deeply entrenched with established networks, territory, and muscle. The second problem was even more significant. One major club had been completely excluded from the Australia 2000 Pact, the Comancheros. Australia's oldest outlaw club wasn't about to roll over. They fought back aggressively and grew into a considerable presence throughout the next decade, disrupting the entire power balance. Meanwhile, the Outlaws were struggling to gain traction. Unlike their rivals, they didn't have decades of established territory. They didn't have the street-level networks. They didn't have the local connections that made drug trafficking and other criminal enterprises profitable. The real breaking point came in 2005, when the Outlaws attempted to establish a chapter in Perth, Western Australia. Perth was controlled by 4 powerful local clubs: the Gypsy Jokers, Club de Rose, God's Garbage, and the Coffin Cheaters. These weren't clubs looking to share. Just 16 years earlier, in 1989, these same 4 clubs had violently ejected the mongrel mob from New Zealand when they tried to set up operations. They bombed the mongrel mob's business with 2 kilograms of gelinite and made it clear outsiders weren't welcome. When the Outlaws approached Perth's established clubs in 2005, they were met with an ultimatum: According to newspaper reports, the existing clubs agreed to let them establish a chapter, but with one humiliating condition. The Outlaws could never wear their patches in public. For an outlaw motorcycle club, this wasn't just an insult, it was a death sentence. The patch, the colors, the club insignia, these are everything. They represent identity, power, and respect. Being told you can't wear them publicly means you essentially don't exist. Sources at the time reported that Outlaws members in Western Australia referred to themselves as gang sympathizers rather than full patch-wearing members. They kept a low profile, operating from a chapter in Balga, a northern Perth suburb, but without the visibility and power that comes from openly displaying club colors. This was unprecedented. The Outlaws were one of the big four American gangs. They had over 1,700 members worldwide operating across dozens of countries. Yet, in Perth, they were essentially neutered. But the challenges went deeper than just Perth. Across Australia, the Outlaws never achieved the dominance they enjoyed elsewhere. While the club's website claims chapters in Australia, the reality on the ground told a different story. They remained marginal players in a market dominated by the Rebels, Bandidos, Hells Angels, and Comancheros, clubs that Australian authorities consider the Big Six of Australian outlaw gangs. The numbers tell the story. By the mid-2000s, the Rebels had around 2,000 members across 29 chapters, making them Australia's largest club. The Bandidos had 400 members across 45 chapters. The Comancheros had 300 members and growing influence. Even smaller clubs like the Gypsy Jokers had 200 to 300 members. The Outlaws? Their membership numbers in Australia were never publicly reported because they remained insignificant. 3 factors ultimately sealed their fate. First, established territory. Unlike in Europe or North America, where the Outlaws could patch over existing clubs or muscle into open territory, Australia's criminal landscape was already carved up. Every profitable drug route, every protection racket, every illegal enterprise was controlled by clubs that had been operating for decades. Second, local resistance. Australian clubs proved fiercely independent. Journalists William Marsden and Julian Scherer wrote that, unlike in Europe or North America, neither the Hells Angels nor the Bandidos succeeded in entirely vanquishing the fiercely independent Australian bikie gangs. If the Hells Angels, the world's most powerful motorcycle club, couldn't dominate Australia, the Outlaws had no chance. Third, the support club failure. In other countries, the Outlaws relied on the Black Pistons Motorcycle Club as their official support club. The Black Pistons would establish first, recruit locally, and eventually feed members into the Outlaws. The Black Pistons didn't establish their first Australian chapter until 2007, 13 years after the Outlaws arrived, far too late to build the necessary foundation. By 2010, the writing was on the wall. While the Outlaws maintained token chapters in Australia, they had become irrelevant in the Australian outlaw motorcycle scene. They weren't involved in the major conflicts, they weren't players in the drug trade, they weren't feared or respected like the dominant clubs. The Australia 2000 Pact itself was later proven to be largely mythical, a media creation that exaggerated the coordination between clubs. But the consolidation it supposedly represented was very real. 35 murders, 146 clubs eliminated, and a handful of survivors who controlled everything. The Outlaws weren't among the survivors. Today, while the Outlaws MC maintains chapters listed in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and Western Australia, their actual influence remains minimal. Australian law enforcement focuses on the Big Six: the Rebels, Bandidos, Comancheros, Hells Angels, Mongols, and Finks when tracking organized crime. The Outlaws aren't on that list. Conclusion. The story of the Outlaws MC in Australia is a reminder that reputation doesn't guarantee success. Being one of America's oldest and most powerful motorcycle gangs meant nothing when facing entrenched local clubs who'd spent decades building their empires through violence and blood. The Outlaws learned what every would-be conqueror eventually discovers. It's not about who you are or where you came from. It's about who controls the ground you're standing on. In Australia, that ground belonged to someone else, and they weren't giving it up.